afterward. And I'll tell you. I don't want to go out on the video. I'll tell you later. So, all right. So we finally come to our last lesson in this 3-year study through John's Gospel. I mean, it's been a trip, hasn't it? So we've survived COVID and lockdown, which was also known as the longest spring break in history, and social distancing, spreading out, sitting in different places. We've moved from one place to another place, and we've learned how to live stream, and all the while working our way inch by inch through John's Gospel. And I appreciate, as I said earlier, I appreciate and admire all of you for sticking with us. And we have actually in all 3 groups added new women. In the morning group, we've added a couple of new ones even halfway through this portion of the study. So, I mean, that surprises me, somebody that's willing to come in that late in a study, and they've really been attentive. And there was one lady, Amy, down at Buffett, that went back and downloaded all the previous studies and put them in a notebook for herself to go over after we finished. I mean, I'm just in awe of that. But it was interesting last night as I was working on putting this last one together, because of the way I study in various commentaries. I'll have to show you what the picture of my nightstand. I mean, Joe says sometimes he's worried that they're going to topple over, and take me out in the middle of the night. But because of the way I study, this section in this commentary and this one, all on John, that over the course of this 3-year study, I've read 7 or 8 whole commentaries on John. This one here, a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit here. So last night when I started putting them all away after I finished getting my notes together for this, the stack is considerably lower. But as I told you last week, I went into this last chapter of John thinking that the whole first part of the chapter was only a prelude or a build-up for what this week's lesson would be. I really seriously contemplated just making one lesson out of the whole chapter, because I thought the first part's it's cut and dried. It is what it is. But then once I started really studying it, I was so glad that I divided it up, because there was so much more in that than I realized. It wasn't until I came to verses 12 and 13 last week that the dynamic of what was really happening there between Jesus and the disciples, until it hit me. And I don't think I'll ever forget that moment. I mean, it was just like a bolt out of the blue, the way that it just hit me, what's happening there. The lesson that I learned from the disciples' hesitation, though as hungry as they must have been, considering this is real, and they've been fishing, working hard, laboring all night long, and then their hesitancy to take the food, this sustenance that Jesus was offering, prompted him in his love to actually take the food and put it in their hands. What I learned from that easily put this portion of John's Gospel in my top 3 things that I've learned in this Gospel. Many people, of course, point to John 3:16 as the high water mark, the greatest point in John's Gospel. And as important as that is, and I don't want to downplay that, but my top 3 are things that I never even saw before. We'll talk about those at the end of the lesson. At the end of your lesson, I ask you to think about what you've learned. And if we have time, and we should, we'll talk about those at the end. But let's talk about this overview. As you read this portion, this last half of chapter 21, what was your impression? What went through your mind? Had you studied this before? What was the setting in which you studied it or heard a sermon on it? And why do you think John chose to add this at the end? So, thoughts or comments? Or questions?
The intensity of the conversation that Jesus had with Peter in just that moment. And what's interesting is there's no other interaction or conversation with anybody else that's recorded there.
No.
It's just Peter and Jesus.
Just Peter and Jesus.
I wonder
what were the others thinking? Yeah. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but were they still sitting around the fire as that part of the conversation was going on? I had always heard it to be that they were out alone, which is what happens later, but I think they're still there. I mean, that's what it looks like to me. Yeah, so what were they thinking? What were the rest of them thinking? Any other thoughts?
I got a better, understanding. I think that is why Jesus asked Peter the same question 3 times.
Mm-hmm. I have always been taught that he asked him the same question 3 times, but they're actually 3 different questions. They just sound very similar. What else? Why do you think John decided to add this on? We talked about that a little bit last time, but why did he decide to add this on?
I think it's important for Peter's ministry and substantiates what Peter did after that.
Yeah, and I think we may have mentioned this last time. It's very important because if we had stopped, as the other Gospels did, with the resurrection or even with the Great Commission after that, the Great Commission is to all of them. Then we get to Acts, and here's Peter in this leadership role. How did you get from here to here if something wasn't fixed between them? Yeah, and I think John is just very concerned that we know what took place. Anything else? Actually, this is, as I first began studying this before last week and asking myself, why did John add this on? One commentary called it the tying up loose ends. And if you don't have this, you are left with the questions of what actually happened there. We've seen it's not only the restoration of Peter, actually in a very real way, it's a restoration of, as J. Vernon McGee called them, those problem children. Excuse me, their hesitancy to take that shows us that there's something going on there. They're not quite sure. They had doubted. They doubted the women. They doubted, of course, Thomas is there, and Thomas doubted even all the rest of them. They doubted the 2 on the road to Emmaus when they came back in and told them, we have seen the Lord. And they doubted all that until Jesus showed up. And so there's that. Maybe they still questioned themselves a little bit. The question now was not with Jesus, but with themselves. If I didn't believe what he clearly told us was going to happen, am I even fit for ministry? And I think that will come up later in this as we talk about Peter. This portion of chapter 21 is much better known than the first part of the chapter. We noted last week that none of us had ever heard a sermon on the 153 fish. But I bet we've all heard sermons on these 3 questions. Have you heard sermons on these or been in a study where you've covered these 3 questions? Don't remember it?
Yeah.
But you know about these 3 questions. Yeah. So, I mean, at least this is familiar to us. It's funny, in all those commentaries that I've used, and I've had the 7 or 8 that I've read through, but I've got probably 4 or 5 more that are all-in-one commentaries. And so, as I've read in all of these, it's funny how for each portion of Scripture, it seems like one commentary will be better for this portion. Another one will be better for this portion. That's why I read them all. Sometimes, and I've been guilty of doing this, I'll think, oh, I've read them all but that one. I mean, what more can they add? And you'll read it and, the light bulb goes off. And they'll just say it in a way that makes it easier to understand. So what that helps me do is combine these things to share with you the best parts of all of these, to put this together. For this particular one, it seemed that R.C. Sproul's and J. Vernon McGee's commentaries on John were the clearest on this particular section than all the others. Coming to verses 15 through 25, J. Vernon McGee said, Jesus did say, and I've told you about him before. If you don't know who he is, he was a real folksy kind of guy. If you've ever heard his teaching, do any of you know who he is? Have you heard him?
I listened to it.
You listen to him on the radio. He's from Texas actually, but real southern drawl, talks real slow, real folksy kind of guy. I think that's why I like him. But coming to these verses, McGee said, Jesus did say, go into all the world and preach the gospel. But he wants you to come and have a good breakfast with him before you go. I just love that about this. So how can we feed others if we have not first dined with Jesus? And so I think that's a good way to start it. What amazed me most, I guess, about the commentaries in these two halves of chapter 21 was that practically all of them in the first half of the chapter looked at it symbolically. I told you last week, I kept looking for one of them to talk realistically about the disciples working all night and how hungry they were and how hesitant they were to take it. And Jesus had to put it in their hands. Nobody covered that. I had one other commentary that I had not read it when I went back home Monday night. No, it's not in that one either. So I've never seen that anywhere. Everything is about the symbolism in the first half of this chapter. They're going fishing and were they leaving the ministry, or were they just, they didn't catch anything. That's a picture of fruitless work without Jesus. I mean, everything in the world you can think of symbolically, everything about being a picture. The miraculous catch, Jesus did that. The food Jesus provided, everything about it was symbolic. Nothing was actual. But then you come to this second half, and everything in every one of the commentaries is actual and factual. And I'm like, come on, at least be consistent here. If it's going to be symbolic, be it all symbolic. If it's going to be factual, let it all be factual. It's like it broke it completely in two. And I think we have to look at Scripture first as actual and factual because it is real. Above all else, this is a real book. It is real history. And then, after we look at it as a real factual event, then look at it symbolically. Then look at the picture that it is teaching us, the application. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 10:11, in speaking about the Israelites wandering in the wilderness, says, now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written down for our instruction, for those of us upon whom the ends of the ages have come. In other words, it was all actual. They really wandered 40 years in the wilderness. They really rebelled. They really did all these things. And we know 40 years of wandering, not everything they did 24/7 is written down. That's impossible. So the things that were written down for a reason. And Paul says they were written down for you to look at and learn from them. That doesn't say it's all symbolic. It was all real first. And then we learn from it. These are very real things, and they really happened. But God in His wisdom had them recorded for our instruction. Like I said, first of all, things happen, and then we learn lessons from them. So let's look at the questions. Where are we, and what is happening? Look at the first part of verse 15. So when they had finished breakfast, okay, we left them with Jesus actually handing them the food. So we talked about this just a little bit, but do you think this exchange took place around the fire, or had Jesus and Peter left the other disciples? Of course, we know John's there, but let's ignore him for a moment. What do you think, and why?
I think they're all there. I think they're just sitting around the fire.
I think they're still sitting around the fire.
I think if they weren't, John would have recorded it that way.
Yeah.
I mean, he added this to this last chapter in here.
Right.
And he's put in the specific details that he is. So
Mhm.
I think if they were dispersed, he would have
Yeah.
said so.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I have always heard it taught that they, as I said a moment ago, they were all, Peter and Jesus were out walking with John following, but that's not what it says. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, they're sitting there. I think they're still sitting there. I imagine it, after Jesus gave the disciples the food, that they ate it. You know, I mean, you're starving, and here it is, you know, in your hand. They ate it, and I think they warmed up to the invitation, and they gathered in, and they sat down on the ground, on the shore there, around this fire. And I think after they're eating there, and well, don't say they're drinking, but I'm sure they had something to drink. But anyway, they're sitting there around the fire, eating, and I think they're all talking. I think they've warmed, I mean, Scripture doesn't say that, but that's what I imagine happened. They've warmed up to it. They're talking, maybe recalling some things that happened through the ministry. Maybe, well, you remember the last time here, you remember we were over there, Jesus, and you fed all that multitude, and talking about things that had happened, except Peter. I think Peter was quiet for once in his life. Peter was quiet. And then Jesus turns to Peter, and he says, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? So look first at what Jesus calls Peter. We always call him Peter, of course, but what did Jesus call him? Simon, son of John. If you go back to chapter 1, what did Jesus call Peter the first time that they met? Of course, we don't use the Aramaic form. We don't call him Cephas. I don't know of anybody that calls him even Simon Peter. We just call him Peter because that's what we've grown up hearing. But you go back to that very first time in John chapter 1, verse 42, when Andrew and James, who had been followers of John the Baptist, started following Jesus, the first thing each of them did was to go and get their brothers. And when Andrew brought Peter to Jesus, what did Jesus say? Did you write that down? Simon, son of John, you shall be called Cephas. That's the Aramaic form. And then John gives us the parentheses, which is translated Peter. In Matthew 16, when Jesus asked the disciples, what's the talk? What is it people are saying about me? Who do men say that I am? And of course they all, some say you're John the Baptist, some say you're one of the prophets, some say you're the prophet, which would have been Moses. And then he asked them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And again, Jesus says, you are Peter. You are Cephas, you are Peter. And on this rock, and there's two different words there for rock. The one for Peter is a different word than the other one. Like Peter's a little rock, and you can imagine the disciples kind of snickered when you're a little rock, this big burly guy, you're a little rock. But on this big rock, on this declaration that you have made, I will build my church. And I didn't realize this, throughout the Gospel of John, John always refers to Peter either as Simon Peter or just Peter, but Jesus has never called him Peter throughout the entire book of John. I did not realize that. I just thought that he did because he calls him Peter in Matthew, but he doesn't. Again, Jesus calls him Simon, son of John. Now, Jesus has given him a new calling, a new name, which represents a new calling. But he's not there yet. He has not totally taken on that new calling yet. So Jesus always calls him Simon when speaking to him. And I said, let me look back here and see exactly how I put that. The Jews set great store by names. Why did Jesus call him that? And we talked here just a little bit about that because he's not lived up to his calling yet. The Jews did set great store by names. I mean, the name Methuselah has a specific meaning to it. The names in the Old Testament, even in the New Testament, Elizabeth and Zacharias, if you read Luke chapter 1, their names had great meanings, and you put those two together and it made an even greater meaning. So names mean great things. We think of Abram and Sarai, changed to Abraham and Sarah. And by the way, just a cool note here that I'll throw out. what is added to their names, if you notice, Abraham and Sarah is an H. H in the Hebrew, I forget the equivalent Hebrew letter for that, but it's the 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it's a letter that represents grace. Oh, how cool is that? That's just one of those tidbits, that sticks in your mind. That's just so cool. And then there's that scoundrel Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. But you'll notice, if you notice in the Old Testament, even after his name is changed, sometimes he's called Jacob, sometimes he's called Israel. Particularly in the Psalms. Sometimes the representation of the nation will be under the name of Jacob. Sometimes it will be Israel. And the reason for that is when they were being rebellious or out of the will of God, they're called Jacob. When they're being faithful, they're called Israel. That's just things like those little things that you read in the Psalms, and you think, well, the psalmist is just Jacob or Israel, because he doesn't want to say Israel over and over and over again. No, there's a reason. There's a reason these words and these names are different. So here, Jesus is speaking to the weakness in Peter's nature. That weakness that we all have in our nature. So before we look at the questions that Jesus asks him, we note that Jesus asks 3 questions. And they look to be the same. In fact, if you read them in the King James Version, it's been a while since I read them, but I think they're identical. And so we grow up thinking, why did he ask him the same thing 3 times? We think they're three same questions, but they are 3 different questions with 3 different answers and 3 different commands to follow them. But first of all, why did Jesus even ask them at all? And we've noted this before many times through this study. Does Jesus ever ask a question for his own information? Never. Never. Old Testament, God never asks a question because he doesn't know. Jesus never asks a question because he doesn't know. So why then does he ask questions? If you already know the answer, Mom, when you say to your child, and you already know the answer to the question, why do you ask the question anyway?
To make them aware.
Exactly. To make them aware, to make them think about it, to make them actually verbalize what Jesus already knows as the answer.
Then it doesn't have any relation to he denied him 3 times.
It probably does. Many scholars say, and that's what I was going to say next, why 3 questions? Many commentaries say that even though Jesus had forgiven Peter in that private setting that we know from the Gospel of Luke and we know that Paul tells us about, still, Paul tells us about that, still Peter had publicly denied Jesus 3 times. And so he needed to be, first of all, he needed to be publicly restored. That was the reason for the public ask. And that's another reason why I think they're all still there together. Peter needs to answer this publicly. One would have done it. One would have restored him, I think. But there are 3 commands, 3 tasks, 3 callings that Peter will have to fulfill. And so each one of these touches on that. And again, to make him even deeper, think about, be aware of, verbalize what he has done. So he needed to be publicly restored. But if not for this public restoration, the question would have always hung over his head, or for the others, what did Jesus really say to him when they were alone? This was done, I think, as much for the other disciples sitting there as it was for Peter. It was greatly for Peter, but it was done for the others as well. So let's look at the first question. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? These what? We're not there. We don't see any body language. We don't know if Jesus is pointing to something or if he, we don't know. So what?
That might be another reason to think that the other stop anything
Yeah, exactly.
than these.
Than these.
Yeah.
So what is it the who or is it the what that Jesus is saying here? Was it more than these things? Your boat, if we are, as we said last week, probably at Peter's place of business. It was Peter's boats. It was Peter's nets. It was, all the equipment was Peter's. Do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than these nets, more than these boats, more than your old life? And that's where some of the commentaries say that Peter was denying Jesus. He was backsliding. He was going into his old way of life. That Jesus is asking him, do you love me more than you love your old way of life? I still don't think Peter was, I don't think Jesus was rebuking him at all for that. But that's one of the questions. Is it these things? Was it, do you love me more than these men? Remember, his brother was there. His business partners were there. And others that may have been relatives. We don't know who all or how they were related. Do you love me more than you love your friends and relatives? What came to my mind, and I imagine Jesus asking me that, was, do you love me more than these hills and hollers? How much we love where we live. We've been so blessed with doing what we love, but do I love them more than do I love what I do more than I love Jesus? That question came to mind. Or was it, do you love me more than these men love me? So which one do you think it was? Or all of the above? It could, in a way, it could be all of them. I think there is a specific these.
I think it's the disciples. That's what I put down. Just
Yeah.
these other men that were with them. I
Yeah.
don't know that they were really concentrating on anything else.
I think, like I said, it could be in a way or partially all three, but I really think the main answer is, do you love me more than these love me? Because, remember what Peter had said before. Some commentaries said that Peter had denied Jesus more than the others, but I don't buy that. I mean, we've talked about this before. Sometimes I think Peter gets a bad rap, He's always the one spontaneous, opening his mouth, doing things, cutting off ears, But at least he denied Jesus, but at least he followed him. The others ran off. He took his eyes off Jesus and began to sink in the water, but he was the only one to get out of the boat. You got to give him that, I think. But Jesus had said in Matthew 26:33, Jesus, at that Last Supper, Jesus had said that all the disciples would fall away. And Peter was the one to boast. I don't care what anybody else does. I won't. I'll be right there. I'll die for you. And in that sense, Peter was saying, I don't care how much they love you. I love you more than they love you. And I think that's what Jesus was pointing to here. But actually, if you go back and read that Matthew passage, you saw that the disciples, after Peter said that, the disciples chimed in and said, oh, we'll go with you to the grave too. And I've often said that in a comfortable home with your bellies full and your bills paid, it's real easy to say, I'll never deny my Jesus. But it's when life gets uncomfortable. If they say you can't have food, you can't go here, you can't go there, you can't meet together, you can't see your family. Now that's when you have to really decide, how much do I love Jesus? In 1 Corinthians 10:12, right after Paul had said that about the Old Testament writings were preserved, he added, if you think you are standing strong, take heed lest you fall. It's easy to say we'll do this or that or the other when we're not faced with doing this or that or the other. And so Jesus is asking, I think, so what do you say now, Simon? You still say you love me more than these men love me? And I put the question in your lesson, is there a difference between trusting someone and loving someone? Because one commentary said that Jesus loved Peter unconditionally, but he had to know that he could trust him. And after I read that and thought about that, I don't really agree with that. I think Jesus knew that he could trust Peter, but the kicker is Peter had to know that Jesus could trust him. See the difference? Peter had to know that he was trustworthy. But if you've heard sermons on this before, you've probably already know that there were two different words used for love here. Jesus uses the word agape, and I knew how to say that. Agapeo. It's the word that's actually here. We know it best as agape, which is the noun version of it. Agape love is very well known. You've probably heard lessons on that, heard sermons on that. It's described many different ways. It's like the word peace in Hebrew, shalom. It means so much more than just the absence of war. It's a well-being. It's an all-encompassing word. And agape love is the same way. It's described different ways. One commentary called it a high and devoted love. Another called it a more dignified or nobler love. It's an all-encompassing love. It's a love that wants the best for someone else. One commentary called it a deep sacrificing love. And I think that's the best way to put it. Sometimes it's even called tough love. You may not be giving to someone what they want, but you're giving to them out of love what they need. That's agape love. So how did Peter reply? He said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And that's a different word for love there. You know that I love you. So why, before we talk about that word, what it means, why do you think Peter answered using a different word? Well, stop. The word means there's no boasting in this word. I have a note in my Bible that says Peter finally understood his own weakness at this point. Peter can't bring himself to use the word agapeo because he knows it's that self-sacrificing love, and he did not do that. He failed when it came right down to it. He uses the word phileo, Phileo, and it means a warm, affectionate love or family love. We get the word Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. And notice now, Peter doesn't compare himself to anyone. He just says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." He doesn't say, "I love you more than anything. More than this, more than that, more than the other, more than these love you." It's just me, myself, and I. I often used to say to my mother, the only person I have to answer for is me. And that's what Peter's doing here. He says, I'm just speaking for me now. All I can answer for is me. You know, and that's that word Edo, you know without me having to tell you that I really care for you a lot. Jesus says, you love me with an all-encompassing love. And Peter says, I just really care for you a lot. He just can't bring himself to say that. And then look at what Jesus said to him. He said to him, tend my lambs. That's the way my translation put it. Tend my lambs. In this series of questions, there are 4 sets of words with different meanings. Love, sheep, feeding, and know. And we don't see now. Now, in a thought-for-thought translation, I really didn't take the time to read it in another translation. It may be broken down different in other translations. But in the King James, it's the same word. And that's why it looks like he's asking him the same thing 3 times, and there are 3 different questions. Some commentaries say that John was just using a series of synonyms, that he just didn't want to use the same word over and over and over, and so he was using synonyms. And I'm like, nah, I don't think so. I believe these words were chosen specifically to convey these different meanings, but because there's these nuances of meanings within these words. 10 my lambs. The word for 10 there really does mean feed. In the King James it says feed my lambs. And it really does mean feed here. Lambs, of course, are baby sheep. We talk about baby Christians, and they can be people of any age. So Peter is told, your first command, your first order of business is to feed or teach the baby believers. That's his job. Teach the baby believers. So verse 16. He said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Do you agapeo me? Do you love me with an all-encompassing love? And Peter said to him, yes, Lord, you know, without me having to tell you, you know that I just really like you a whole lot. I really care for you. He just, you wonder if he really wanted to say agape. But he just couldn't bring himself to do it because he knows himself too well. And Jesus said to him, shepherd my sheep. Now the word shepherd here means to direct care to or discipline. It literally means to discipline. And the word for sheep is grown-up sheep, mature believers. And so a second calling that Peter has is to discipline or direct the more mature believers. Teach the new ones, direct the more mature ones. And then verse 17. Jesus said to him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you phileo? Do you really care for me a lot? He uses the word that Peter has been using. Do you really care for me a lot? Why do you think Jesus changed the word?
I think to ease Peter's mind.
Yeah.
I think it's okay, Peter.
It's okay. And I agree with that. But I have read in some commentaries that the tone of voice is Jesus saying, do you really even care for me? You say you care for me a lot. Do you really even care for me a lot? And I'm like, I don't think this is an accusatory way. I think you're right. I think it's to ease Peter's mind. He comes down to Peter. And then John tells us that Peter was grieved because Jesus said to him the third time, do you love me? Do you phileo me? So why was Peter grieved? Was it because Jesus asked him a third time or because Jesus changed the word?
I think it's because he's thinking, have I failed this pitifully?
Yeah.
That you don't think it at all?
Yeah. Yeah. I think you're right. I think he's hurt. Like Amy said, Jesus came down and used his words to say it's okay. But on Peter's view of it, it is you had to do that. You had to come down to this. And again, I don't think it's an accusatory. Do you even care for me? I think Peter's just so brokenhearted. He's grieved. I don't. It could be that Jesus does it a third time, but I don't think that's the major point. I think it's the change in the word that that Jesus would have to do that for
Could
him.
he be also thinking back to his denial?
Oh, I'm sure.
This is the third question, and he's probably putting these pieces together.
Yeah, I'm sure that's going on in his mind, and I'm sure that's not the first time that has gone around in his mind.
This is the third time now. When you think about it, Jesus told him he was going to do it.
Yeah,
And then he did it.
yeah,
And it's like, whoops, what I just did.
yeah.
And now,
And now he's reminding him of it, although he didn't need reminding. It was there, whether he allowed himself to. We all know what that's like. These things come to mind at times when we just really wish they wouldn't. Times when we failed, and we don't want to think about it to start with, and we don't want to be reminded of it, because it's hard enough to keep it pushed back in the closet where it's supposed to stay. And like it could be either because he asked a third time or because he changed the word. And the commentaries vary on this, but McGee is on with what we're saying, Amy. McGee said that Peter was grieved because Jesus had to stoop down to his level. But look at how Peter answered this time. Peter said to him, Lord, Edo, you know without me even having to tell you, you know all things. You know, and that's the different word, that's gnosko, that's to know by experience. You know by experience that I truly love you. In verses 15 and 16, the word Edo, the word know is Edo, it means to perceive or understand. And I put in your lesson, this is used in Revelation chapters 2 and 3 when Jesus says to the churches, I know your works. Nobody has to tell him about the churches. He knows, he perceives, he understands. He doesn't have to experience it. But the word for know in the second word in verse 17 is gnosko, which means to know by experience. Peter is saying, you know without me telling you that I really care a lot for you. Yes, I failed, but you have also experienced how much I really care for you. You've experienced, I've been there. And although the text doesn't say it, I imagine Jesus smiling now when he says, tend my sheep. The word here, tend, again, goes back to the first command, means to feed, but now it's feed the mature believers. And we actually have a visual of this throughout the New Testament. Peter is carrying out all three of these commands. First of all, in the book of Acts, that day of Pentecost, when he gave that sermon, he fed or he led people to Jesus in that sermon on that first day, that day of Pentecost. He also shared the gospel with Cornelius and all of Cornelius' household in Acts chapter 10. So he was feeding the baby believers. But Peter also spoke with wisdom, and he disciplined the mature believers in Acts chapter 11 and again in Acts chapter 15 when there was a controversy. Peter spoke up, particularly in Acts chapter 11. It's real interesting to us because they go through this whole give and take and debate and back and forth, and Peter doesn't say a word, and then finally at the end Peter speaks up. We were used to Peter jumping right in there at the beginning, but he has mature words right at the end. And so he does that. He feeds the new believers, he disciplines or guides the mature believers, and then in the two epistles that Peter wrote, he taught and is still teaching today mature believers. So he's has carried out all three of those commands that Jesus has given him. So any questions or comments on that section? Because that's the portion that generally has the most, the commentaries vary on it. And so there are differences of opinion on that. And so you just got my opinion on that. So if you disagree, that's okay. But any comments or questions on that? Did that make sense? Did that teach that well? For those watching at home, all I'm getting is, the bobbleheads. So, okay. So, if we go on, verse 18. Jesus' words in verse 18 connect to the commands that he has just given Peter. One commentary said that love brought Peter a task, those three commands, but it also brought him a cross. So look at verse 18. Jesus said, truly, truly, and we know anytime that he starts a statement with that, it's a new teaching, it's either a prophecy or something new that he's sharing. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were younger, you used to gird yourself and walk wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will gird you and bring you where you do not wish to go. Now, the early church fathers hold to this verse. Some we don't know if this is legend or if this is truth. That how Peter's arms were stretched out. Of course, we have the story of Peter being crucified, and he asked not to be crucified the same way of Jesus, and so he's crucified upside down. There are others that say they stretched out his arms. Others talked about him girding him, reaching out his hands, tying him up. All these things. We don't have that until later teachers look back on this. But we know, of course, that this is a prophecy of how Peter will die. But put yourself there in that moment. Even though this is a prophecy of how he will die for Jesus. At that moment, I think Peter realizes that he's been restored. That, yes, Jesus had probably told him in that meeting, or when Jesus talked to him, that he was forgiven, but there's a difference in being forgiven and being restored. And I think he understands now that not only has he been forgiven, but he's been restored to a leadership role. He's given a task. You do this, and do this, and do this. As we said a moment ago, Jesus did not ask those three questions for his own benefit. He didn't ask them because he didn't know. He asked them for Peter's benefit. Jesus had already forgiven Peter. But here's the key. Peter had to forgive himself. Your sins can be forgiven. But if you don't accept that, if you don't realize that your sins are forgiven, you'll carry that weight around forever. Sometimes we know that we are forgiven, but forgiving ourselves is the hardest part, particularly if you've been a Christian for a number of years and you mess up. I should know better. I should never have said that. I should never have done that. And we beat ourselves up over those things. Forgiving ourselves is the hardest part. The world does not know what to do with their guilt. Even if we carry it, we know what we're supposed to do with it. Not only do we ask forgiveness, what is it? 1 John 1:9, is that it? If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins. That's not for our salvation. That's to restore fellowship. As long as there's this cloud or this veil of sin between us and Jesus, on Jesus' side, it's like it's not even there. It's been forgiven. But we've got it up there. And until we confess, we can't restore the fellowship that's there. So here the fellowship has been restored. The world doesn't know what to do with their guilt. We must not only lay our sin at the foot of the cross, we have to lay our guilt there as well. So just in case we didn't know what this meant, John tells us in verse 19, now this he said, signifying by what death Peter would glorify God. And then Jesus gives Peter one final command. Well, actually, he gives him two, but he gives this next command. And when he had spoken this, Jesus said to Peter, follow me. So, is this a command for Peter to be reinstated? Or is this very practical? And they get up from the breakfast fire, follow me, and now they walk away. I think that's what it is. It may be a command that he's reinstated, follow me, but I think it's much more practical. Come with me. I think, and I didn't look, yeah, I did. They're the same word as in verse 22. It does mean follow me, but that's That's a literal word as well as a spiritual word. Follow me. It's very practical. Let's go for a walk now. And it's really interesting. This is what I found over the years in reading commentaries, is that sometimes if they don't know how to deal with something, they just skip plumb over it. I mean, it's like it's not even there. I'm like, this is what I really wanted to know about. But this portion of verse 19 is actually skipped over, ignored in most of the commentaries. But I think it could be both. I think, at any rate, if they have been sitting around the fire during this previous exchange, now they are going away from the others. And I think that because of the way it says Peter looked around. If they're sitting there around the fire, it's not like he has to look around too much to see John. But when they left the others, verses 20 and 21, Peter, turning around, which leads me to think that he and Jesus are walking away from the crowd, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them. And if we don't know who that is, John tells us that it's the one who had leaned back on Jesus' breast at the supper and said to Jesus, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? I mean, he just pretty well lays that out, who this is. But we said, good old Peter. Verse 21, Peter, therefore, seeing him, said to Jesus, Lord, what about this man? And our first reaction is, this is just another case of Peter opening mouth and inserting foot. But I'm not really sure that's what it is. And again, I think, as I said a while ago, I think Peter's gotten a bad rap. When you really dissect and really look at every single instance that we would say, that we would attribute to an impetuous Peter, if you really look at every one of those, I think we'll see that his heart was in the right place. He was not really being just flying off the handle. He really believed that what he was doing was the right thing, even down to the point of risking his own life to take that little bitty knife and try to kill that soldier, that high priest servant with it. He had no regard for his own life at all. And I think that was intentional. I don't think he was acting without thinking. I think he was doing it on purpose to maybe create a distraction, let Jesus get away, take my life instead of his, because they would have killed him. But aside all that, here he says, what about this one? And like I said, we tend to say, good old Peter. But really, think about what Peter was saying and how he was saying it. Peter's literal words are, but this one, what? So, is this just Peter being Peter? Or did Peter do this out of concern for John? What do you think? Maybe a little bit of both. Peter is impetuous. He does open his mouth sometimes when he shouldn't. And maybe the way he said it.
Well, they were John and Peter were two of his closest.
Yeah, two of Jesus' closest.
Yes.
But even before that, I think Peter and John were very close.
Yeah. And so I think it was just
Yeah. Is he going to have to suffer? Yeah, I really think the more I've studied this, the more I think that's what it is too. My opinion is that I think Peter cared about what's going to happen to John. Now, we all know this. It's one thing to have to suffer yourself, but you don't want your kids to suffer, or you don't want your friends to suffer, or your spouse to suffer. You would much rather suffer yourself than have somebody you love suffer. And so Peter is saying, okay, that's what I'm going to have to do. Don't tell me he's going to have to face that too. I mean, think about it. We often see Peter and John together. They were there together when Mary Magdalene came and told them about the tomb was empty. Even in the book of Acts, they do ministry together. Their brothers, James and Andrew, were Jesus' first disciples, and they each went and got their brothers, Peter and John. And it just seems that Peter and John, although as opposite in nature of any two people can be, it just seems they're very close. Maybe, Peter is older and John is the youngest. Maybe Peter looked upon him as his little brother. Maybe he'd known it. Maybe Peter, as a young boy or a young man, was there when John was born, and he held him as a baby. We were talking the other day about some of you know Joe's dad and George McNutt, and George. They were first cousins, but George was about 10 years older than Bob, and we actually have a picture of George sitting on the porch in a straight back chair, holding Bob as a baby. And so there's always been that connection there between the two of them their whole lives. And I just think that's probably what it was with Peter and John. Peter is actually saying, what about him? What's he going to have to do? Maybe he was saying that. Or what's he going to do? But I really think he was concerned for John's life. But now look at how Jesus replied. Jesus, and this is in the present tense again. So Jesus says to him, if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. In verse 19, Jesus just simply says, follow me. But in verse 22, he says it very emphatically, you follow me. The King James Version says, follow thou me. The thou word there is emphatic. You follow me. The you is implied, of course, in verse 19, but in 22, it's a pointed statement. You do this. And it would indicate that Jesus is saying, it's none of your business. But I don't think it's said with a harshness to it, but with a direction instead. In Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2, we are told that in verse 1, with all that, that great cloud of witnesses that go before us, those great examples that we have to follow. But in verse 2 of Hebrews 12, we are told to keep our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. And so that's what Peter's being told. I know you love him, but he's not your concern now. Peter would have a responsibility, and so would John. But Peter was only responsible for Peter. As much as we love our kids, and as much as we want to teach them to do the right things, there still comes a point in life when they have to make their own decisions. We can't answer from. I've often said God has no grandchildren. Every person has to come to Christ for themselves. We can't do it for them. And so I believe that's what Jesus is saying to Peter. You have a responsibility, but so does John. I was reminded, as I was reading this and studying this, I was reminded of Deuteronomy 29:29, which begins, the secret things belong to the Lord our God. There are some things that are just simply not ours to know. We operate on a need-to-know basis, and there's some things we just don't need to know. But the rest of Deuteronomy 29:29 is very important. We always cabbage in on that first part. The secret things belong to God. Like I don't have to understand it. But there is something else there that says, but those things which are revealed belong unto us and to our children forever, that we may do all the works of this law. We're not responsible for what we don't know, but we are responsible for what we do know. Peter and John were to have different functions. Neither one of them more important than the other, but just different. Both servants and not rivals. Several of the commentaries actually went in a great deeper path here and compared the ministries of Peter and John and Paul in the things that they did. Paul truly traveled to the uttermost parts of the world. Peter traveled some, but John, it seems, stayed close to home. Why? We don't know. Maybe it had something to do with caring for Mary. He cared for her until her death. Basically, Paul was a pioneer for Christ. Peter was a shepherd, and John was a witness. And we've seen from the details, we've talked about it many times, the amount of details that we've been given in this gospel. You and I, too, have different gifts and abilities. I heard this story once about this guy was with a group of kindergartners, and he gave them each a position or a vocation. You know, you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a teacher, you're an astronaut, you're a this, that. And I went through the whole class, and one was a janitor. And he said, now, I want you to get in line in order of importance. So, you know, the doctors and the teachers are fussing. Well, I'm a doctor. Well, you wouldn't be a doctor if you didn't have a teacher, you know, on and on and on. Well, the little boy who was the janitor went to the other end and just stood there because he figured janitor was on the lowest part of the list. But what the man then did was have them stand in a circle, because neither one of them could do their job without the others doing their job. Each of our jobs are very, very important. So Jesus said to Peter, don't worry about someone else's gift or calling. Your job is for you to follow me. And I think Peter did just that. But, you know, I can't help but think that I bet he thought about this day many times throughout his life. And especially as he neared death, he thought about it even more. And I gave you that scripture in 2 Peter 1:14 where he says, he was saying that the time is close, knowing that the laying aside of my earthly dwelling is imminent. And then he says, as also our Lord Jesus Christ has made clear to me. He told me this was going to happen. And then verse 23, this saying therefore went out among the brethren that disciple would not die. Yet Jesus did not say to him he would not die, but only if I want him to remain until I come, what is that to you? And it's a perfect example of how rumors get started. But John, you know, that word may have actually gotten there in Ephesus where John lived. I mean, and John is nearing 100 by now, and that's unheard of. I mean, it's a big deal today if somebody's in their late 90s or 100 or 100 plus. Joe's grandfather lived to be 102. So, you know, that's a big deal. But it was an even bigger deal in those days. And they may have started saying, you know, that thing that Jesus said, that may just be true. But John wants them to know, no, that's not what it was at all. Well, then John makes this final statement, verse 24. This is the disciple who bears witness of these things and wrote these things, and we know that his witness is true. Why do you think he felt the need to say that?
Just to validate what he was writing.
Yeah, to validate it. I didn't write it down somewhere. I can't spot it. Somewhere in chapter 19, he says something very similar to that. And when he talks about Jesus dying on the cross, he says, I can't spot it. Anyway, he says basically the same thing. The one who's saying, this is true, I was there, I saw it, essentially. But here's the thing. There are some who will say, the way he writes this is the disciple who bears witness to these things and wrote these things. That part of it, he could very well have said, but what about the second part of that verse? And we know that his witness is true. It's almost like it's written in third person. Do you think John wrote this, or do you think someone else wrote this? Perhaps there's a word for it, but the one who's actually doing the writing down of John's recollections and John's sharing.
Well, you know, he never referenced himself
Yep.
as me the entire time.
Yeah.
It was always very subtle
Mm-hmm.
as to who he was.
Yeah.
No matter what part he played and what's going on in the whole book.
Yeah.
So I think he wrote it.
I think you wrote it too. Now, we don't know for sure, of course, whether John was using, it's referred to as the editorial we did this, or, I'll talk about our Bible study, or we did that, and when really, whatever it was, I did, but we use that way, or it could have been added by someone else. My opinion is that he wrote it, but even if it was added, it doesn't take away from the authenticity of everything else that was written. Even if he was not I wish I could think of that word. It starts with an A, the one who's actually doing the writing for somebody else. I'll find that when I go home. But anyway, whether it was added, it doesn't take away from the authenticity. We believe that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, including Deuteronomy, even though the last chapter in Deuteronomy records Moses' death. And we know Moses didn't write that. We know that was added in by someone, probably Joshua. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Moses wrote all the rest of it. And the postscript, or this added part, was written by someone else. Whether John actually wrote that or not is not important. But the fact that he said, this is the disciple who bears witness, is what is important in this. As for the reason, John knew the importance, and we've seen this throughout John's gospel, kind of in subtleties, but John knew the importance or the sanctity of making an oath. Remember that whole section in chapter 5 where Jesus, we don't notice it in our English languages, but the wording that's used, it's an official statement that Jesus makes at the end of chapter 5. It's like he's under oath, or he's before a tribunal or something. The formality of what he's saying is done a certain way. And it's like John is doing that. It is taking an oath is so important to the Jewish people. And he's saying, this is my oath. If he had a Bible, maybe he laid his hands on what he'd written. He had a Bible and he raised his right hand and he said, I swear that this is true. He said, this disciple bears witness. You may not remember, it's been so long ago, but at the very beginning of our study, we saw that the word witness was going to play a great role in this Gospel of John. This word witness is very important to John. In fact, it's used more than 45 times in John's Gospel, the word witness. And so this is John's testimony, as we might say, an expert witness. I asked a judge friend of mine once, I said, I had seen some stuff on TV and where he was conducting a trial, and I said, he was actually grilling someone that was supposed to be an expert witness. And so I asked him, I said, what makes someone an expert witness? I mean, sometimes you'll see trials and they'll bring somebody in from outside who really doesn't have anything to do with the trial. He may not even know the particulars of the trial. But in one specific area, they are an expert. And so they are an expert witness. And so I asked him, I said, what makes an expert witness? And he explained that they are an expert in some facet that needs to be explained in layman's terms. They know how to break it down. They know how to explain it in a way that's understandable. And so John was there almost from the very beginning. And he was not only an eyewitness, as he said in the prologue, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. We saw him, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. He was an eyewitness, and he was an expert witness as well. Now, we don't base our faith on emotion, but we do, to a great extent, base our faith on experience, either our own experiences or the experiences of others. If we're a very young Christian, we may base a lot of our experience on our parents or our grandparents. Or even if not that, we base our understanding and experience on things that we know from Scripture. It's like the blind man in chapter 9, where he said, this one thing I know. Once I was blind, now I see. He based his faith on his experience. A Christian is someone who can say, I know Jesus Christ and I know this book is true. Think about those two words that we've talked about through this lesson and in other lessons, those two words for know. First of all, Edo. We know it because we recognize that it is true. Second of all, we know it, gnosko, by experience. And then John says, almost as a footnote, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books which were written. In other words, he says, this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Isn't it interesting that he writes in third person, but then in verse 25, I suppose.
It is, right, I hadn't know, that's right. That's the first time that, I think, first time in the whole book that he's used a personal pronoun. I suppose. Good point. I have to make a note of that because I didn't pick up on that. But what I found it interesting that one commentary said that in this gospel, all 21 chapters of it just covers some 20 days out of Jesus' entire 3.5-year ministry. Whoa! They're selected incidences that put together cover just some 20 days out of 3+ years of ministry. How could it be any more wonderful? I mean, you think about how much more there could have been. How much more wonderful could it be? I mean, I can't think of anything else that was not there that would have made it any better than it was. It was just, John said, I gave you this because this is what you needed to know. These are the signs in order for you to know. Back in chapter 20, these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So, here, for those who've been watching the live stream or watch this on video, I hope you've enjoyed this study. But we're going to end the video here. And so if you're watching online or watching the video, please comment and let us know what you've learned. But we're going to turn it off for here. All right, now I'm going to ask